Hi, I'm Ethan. I love muzzleloading. Today we're continuing with our Investarms Flintlock Hawken kit and talking about the tools you need to work on and complete this muzzleloader kit. Before we get started, I wanted to say that I have a rather extensive shop here. I'm very fortunate in that regard. So some of the tools that we're talking about here might be a little over the top for some of you. It might not be something that you want to go out and buy. You may not want to go out and buy a $150 set of chisels, especially if this is just your one and only muzzleloader kit. So keep that in mind as you're looking at and hearing about some of these tools. I'm going to try to give an overview of where you can get some of these tools and what to look for regardless of your budget. But keep in mind that when you buy a good tool, first you spend that money once and you don't spend any more time and money hunting up a better tool down the road. That's kind of how I think about buying tools and things that I can find useful for many years to come, and something I just want to pass on to you at home as you're thinking about investing in some of these tools to build a muzzleloader. Here I have the first page of the instructions for this kit that you can download from muzzleloaders.com and print off at home. What we're going to be talking about is the first half of the recommended tools and supplies here. This is going to be mainly for the stock shaping and parts fitting. Later on we'll talk about the metal finish and the wood finish. This is a rather basic set of tools, so I'm going to go into some of the tools that I like to use when building a kit like this and go into a little bit more detail. So what I have here by and large are the tools and materials that you're going to need to shape and fit a stock or a kit like this one. It's not going to be every tool, so in the production you might see a little bit, you might see an extra tool here and there. I'll be sure to point those out, but in large part these are most of the tools that I'm going to be using to assemble this kit. First up is just a simple number 2 pencil. You'll see in my apron I have a ton of these because I'm always setting them down and losing them. It's really nice to be able to mark a section of your stock as you're working on it so that you know to stay in a particular area while you're working. Nothing special there. As we move on here, the next kind of section we have here is a group of files. Now, a lot of folks are going to tell you that modern files stink, but a lot of times that's what we can get a hold of. So, you can go down to your local hardware store, like a Harbor Freight or a Menards, Home Depot, Ace Hardware, and any number of those stores and pick up a set of files, a set of woodworking or metal files. These files here, I just kind of use, these files here that I have in this section of the shop are multi-purpose for building muzzleloaders and muzzleloader kits like this one. So they function both, soft metal and wood. I'm not really worried about them too much. What you want to look for is a graduation in roughness. So this is a pretty rough rasp, technically not a file, but we're going to use a rough rasp like this one to shape and remove a lot of wood fast, and then we'll work our way down in file roughness as we get closer and closer to the finishing stage and ultimately finish out with some sandpaper. But I'm going to use this to take off some of the knobs and other hard corners left over on the stock of this kit. I like this as just kind of a large flat rasp. You'll notice both sides are flat, and both of these sides here have kind of a coarse tooth to them as well. So we can use all aspects of this rasp and get into kind of some nooks and crannies. Next, I have a little bit of a finer file here. You can see the teeth on this one. They just go in one direction. This is something I work a really large area with, not really a detail file here. Again, for more of shaping the larger shapes and sections of this stock. Next, I have an even finer flat file, really just kind of a scaled down version of the other ones that we've been taking a look at. I like this file a lot. It's been in my family for a long time. It was actually my grandfather's. But apart from the sentimental value, it's just about used up. And so it's a really fine file, even finer than a fine file should be. So I like to use this for just a little bit of wood here and there and a lot of the metal finish. I can get a nice dull brightness out of this file when I'm working either wood or metal, which I really enjoy. Being kind of smaller, it's a lot more detail work, but that flat file allows me to work some wider areas which I really like. Again, thinking about these tools, you want to pay attention to the roughness or the coarseness as well as the size and shape, because both of those factor into the usability when we're building a muzzleloader kit. Next up, this is a number 2. You can see there, half round file. It has teeth on both sides here, so we have a nice flat face here that goes into a little point up here, and then on the other side we have a half round. So this is really nice for working our trigger guards, getting into kind of the nooks and crannies of the hardware. So as we're working this half round file is going to allow us to get into this area here of the trigger guard, kind of these swoops and curves. If you can only get a couple files, a fine half round like this one will serve a similar function as our other flat fine file here, because we have this flat face. These are just, you know, it's kind of up to your personal preference and your personal budget. So if you can only have 1 or 2 small files, make sure one of them is a fine half round like that one there. Something else you can do when looking for files or any of the other tools that we're talking about here today is head to some like antique malls or flea markets. A lot of times there'll be somebody there set up with old tools. And you can pick up some nice older tools that last and still work. A lot of times you want to look for a European or German made tool or an American made tool kind of from really the 20th century, or the earlier the better. As an example of some of the tool brands or file brands that I recommend if you can find them, this is an American made Simon's file, and this is an American made Nicholson file. Nicholson is kind of I think the gold standard when it comes to a lot of files for contemporary use. So keep that in mind if you're being thrifty and shopping for some used tools. Files specifically with the Nicholson name. Next, I want to talk about some wood carving tools, mainly a chisel and a knife of some sort. As an example, on some of these inlets, especially on these kits of all brand of kits, the trigger guards sometimes need some work, and some of the barrel tenon extension holes here, and sometimes your barrel tang or your barrel itself need a little bit of work. Nothing major like you'd see on a lesser developed kit or really a more expensive kit, a more you know, these are really, in comparison to a lot of kits out there, pretty easy to put together. But when it comes to those kits, it's nice to have a few carving chisels. I have here, these are Swiss made file chisels, PFIEL, that you can pick up from a shop like Woodcraft or another wood carving or woodworking supply shop. I have a few here. This is a number 5 swoop. You can see there just a little bit. I like a nice subtle curve like this chisel here for working on an inlet. It allows you to get around a nice curve, and it's not so curved that you can't work some flat areas with it. Here I have another fairly severe, this is what I'd call a veiner or a V tool or a V chisel. This is very small, allowing us to get into some nice corners as needed. I think this here is a number 12 V tool, and this curved here is a number 5 gouge probably. Here I have another larger gouge. This is a number 11. You can see how deep that curve is there. Odds are we're not going to need a chisel like this on this kit, but I like this because I can use either side of the chisel, that kind of gouge space there, to work some wood as needed. Really, the chisel that you're going to want or use the most on a muzzleloader kit like this one is going to be a small skew like this one. Skew, you can see here, this is a flat chisel, but the end is cut there at an angle. This is really the most useful carving chisel, I think, in my entire shop. This is just a nice, I think this is just a Woodcraft, shop brand skew here. But for a kit like this, for removing tiny bits of wood in an inlay here and there as needed, over the gouges that I've shown you, the skew is really what you want to have. I don't have a specific number on this skew, but you can kind of see it in relation to my hand there. A lot of muzzleloader builders you're going to see are going to be using these palm chisels like this one. It's nice because you can use them really one-handed on a stock. If you're out there and you can only find a larger chisel, that's okay, but really these palm chisels are the way to go if you're looking for single purpose or small inlay or small carving chisels. They're just really comfortable and really usable. In some of the other videos on the channel where I've talked about muzzleloader kit building, you're going to see this chisel in particular used a lot. If you can only afford to get one chisel, one carving chisel like I've shown you here today, it's definitely going to be the small skew like I have here. Definitely something that you want in your shop, especially if you're doing a variety of muzzleloader kits down the road. Next up, in kind of the wood carving space, I have what I call just a bench knife. This is a knife that just lives on the bench. This happens to be a Swiss-made knife. This is just kind of a beater carving knife. It's used for anything and everything. I'm not too worried about the condition of the blade. It's an affordable knife that I can sharpen as I need to. So if I get a nick or a ding in there, or need to sharpen it a lot, I'm not too worried about it. It's just nice to have a small knife like this one with a nice thin blade going out to the front there. In addition to this, I would recommend an X-Acto knife with a replaceable blade. That would be even finer than this blade and is really useful for tracing around a metal part to inlay. You know, an X-Acto knife could be used in the stead of that bench knife there if you need to, you know, cut some costs and in many ways possibly be a little more usable. Moving on from the bladed tools that we've talked about here, I have a variety of sandpapers. The Investarms instruction manual here recommends 150, 180, and 220 grit sandpaper. That's fine. That's a great recommendation to get you started. What I have here in my shop is several strips of 80 grade, or 80 grit, thinking about grains for other things. 80 grit sandpaper. This is some 120 grit sandpaper, and I think this is some 240 grit sandpaper. I picked up a bunch of these just long strips of sandpaper like this one at a flea market years ago, and I'm still using them today. I will say, in addition to like your 240 or your 220 grit sandpaper, hold on to your strips of sandpaper, especially the finer grits, as they kind of wear out, because you can see here, even though there's not a lot of grit left on this strip of sandpaper, this is super useful when it comes to polishing your metal hardware. Because it's so worn out and so flexible, you can get into the nooks and crannies of like a trigger guard or around different lock parts and get them nice and polished up without worrying about having to go in again with more sandpaper. So what I like to do, especially on metal hardware like this one, where we still have our rough casting finish on here, is I'll start with like the 80 grit, jump up to the 120 or the 150, the 180, and then do the 220 like Investarms recommends here, or your 240, whatever you have in that kind of, you know, 10 or 20 up and down grits there. But then I'll go through, once all of that is done, and do almost a polish pass with this worn out sandpaper. So hold on to some of this stuff as you use it. You don't need to throw all of it away. Keep a couple strips back. It's going to be really handy for getting an interesting and a nice finish on your hardware. Last here on the bench, I have just a simple screwdriver. This happens to have replaceable bits, and it ratchets, which is kind of nice for some of these smaller screws and things. I like the replaceable tips because on a kit like this, I have a variety of screw sizes, and with replaceable tips, I can make sure I'm getting the right tip or bit for my specific screw. When you're building a muzzleloader kit like this one, you don't want to mar or mess up your screw heads. It kind of contributes to, you know, if you want it to look nice and keep it nice, you want to use a bit all the time that matches your screw head. You don't want to flex or dent those or mar them. You can clean that up, but if you don't do it in the first place, if you're careful, it's not too hard. So this tip here is just a 7/32. It seems to fit kind of the larger screw heads or bolt heads in this kit. What you want to look for is you want that bit to go down and be flush with the base of the notch in your bolt or screw head. That way you get the most contact that you can out of your screw bit there, or your screwdriver bit. And then I can switch this out for an even smaller bit as needed for some of my smaller screws like this one here. I think, like I mentioned in the first video, it's nice to have a parts bin where you can store all of your little bits and pieces for your kit and know you're not going to dump them or lose anything. Just keep everything that you're not using as far as hardware-wise in something like this to keep track of everything. You can pick these up at the dollar store, at the hardware store, and they're really useful, I think. All in all, these are the kind of tools that I like to use and I'm comfortable with. If you have other tools, you don't need to have these specific tools. This is kind of a variety to get you started on a kit like this Investarms that we're going to be building here on the channel. If you have other tools that you would recommend a new builder check out, please leave them in the comments below. I'm happy to add them to the blog post and information that goes along with this kit series as we build them. If you have any questions about finding tools or if a tool is good, feel free to reach out and ask. I'm more than happy to help give you my tips or pointers or suggestions on tools and answer any questions that you might have. Again, you don't need to spring for the most expensive tools out there, but if you are looking to be involved with muzzleloading in a real passionate way and build more kits and more of your own accoutrements and things over the years, I really recommend saving up and buying the right tool once and saving your money and time that way. You won't be disappointed, I promise you, but it is, it is a little money up front, and I understand that. Apart from the hand tools that we've talked about here, there's a couple other kind of larger tools that I want to talk about that you may want, especially if you're looking at doing more of this, again, like I keep saying. The first being a nice workbench. You want a nice, stable platform that you can work on, and something that you don't have to worry about dinging up or getting stained or scratching. I don't really recommend trying to build a muzzleloader kit on your kitchen table unless you're putting down a lot of cardboard or tarps or anything to keep that clean. If you can, more power to you, but it's nice to have a dedicated space where you can leave parts and tools and things as they dry and not have to worry about them being moved around by somebody else. So I recommend having a stable workbench. This can even be a fold-out card table if that's all you can get your hands on. That's totally okay. You just want a space where you can spread this stuff out, keep an eye on it, and work on it at your own pace. In addition to a workbench, every muzzleloader kit builder out there really needs to get a kind of vise. Now, there's a lot of different vices out there. I think the common one really to go get is a Harbor Freight vise, which from what I hear does a fine job. But if you're looking to do more of this or get more involved with muzzleloading, it really pays dividends to get a nice multi-axis rotating vise if you can afford it. Now again, you don't need to buy something like this new. I really encourage you to check out farm sales, antique malls, flea markets, thrift shops, that kind of thing. There's always tools kind of circulating in those spaces, and a lot of times nice quality vintage or retro tools that are much better than the kind of things that you can buy new today. Looking at the vise I have here, you'll see I have it built onto kind of a multi-part platform so that it fits into my workbench. This vise really lives on this section of the workbench, but I can remove it if I need to, which is handy depending on the kind of projects that I have. You'll see I have a leather piece in the jaw here. You can put a fabric piece in there or something, but leather is really nice. Helps protect your stock or your hardware from any wear and tear that you might get, opening and closing those jaws, and helps you to keep from over compressing the parts that you're working on. You'll notice that this vise rotates kind of in the Y-axis around its central stem. I can also pivot this back and forth in the X-axis as well and kind of rotate it around to get into the nooks and crannies of a stock or part that I'm working on. You don't necessarily need that X rotation forwards and backwards, but I will say the rotation in the Y-axis around its center is super handy for a stock and a kit like this one that we're building here. The next few things that I have here are a little bit of a DIY solution here, but you'll see a lot of contemporary builders having something like this on their bench. This here is what I just would call a stock or barrel rest. This sits on the other side of my bench, so I can span from my vise out to this block. It supports the barrel or the forestock of the muzzleloader that I'm building, so that I'm not putting too much pressure on one end or the other. Like if I was holding my wrist of the muzzleloader in the vise, I need something out here to support the barrel so that it's not constantly wobbling back and forth. This just helps give you a nice stable work surface. This is just built out of some plywood, I think 3/4 inch plywood on the side and some scrap 2x4 here in the center. You don't really need to go real fancy with this. You'll see some folks put leather over the top, again, to prevent any dings or scratches or anything. I also, on this side, have a little swing up stop like this one so that I can put my barrel or my forestock against this, and my muzzleloader isn't walking off of the stand as I'm working on it kind of back at the buttstock end. Really, there's a million solutions out there for something like this. I encourage you to check out like the American Long Rifles forum or the Muzzleloading forum and look at some of the pictures of other builders' benches. Everybody has their own kind of setup for something like this. Just like with muzzleloading in general, there's a million different ways to do it, and they're all right. That's just what I have set up, and it was really quick and easy to put together here in the shop. I have it set up to be about the same height as my vise so that I can get a nice straight working plane from my vise to that support. When I'm using that support too, I'll C-clamp or bar clamp that to my bench so I know it's not going anywhere as I'm working on any of these pieces. You'll see this in use a lot in the videos as they come here. So if this doesn't make sense as I'm saying it here, check out the videos and you'll see it in action, and I think it'll make a little more sense for you. I'm Ethan, I love muzzleloading. I'd like to thank you so much for watching. Now that we've covered the tools, we're ready to jump in here and work on our kit and start making some actual progress here. So thank you so much for sticking around. Really appreciate it and hope you enjoy the rest of the series.